Is it smarter to work on your comic digitally, or is working on it traditionally still easier and faster? And what about hybrid workflows? We're going to talk about all of that in this video. Welcome back to Pencils and Stories. My name is Henrike and I make and teach comics. If you want to make your own comics as well, then subscribe to this YouTube channel for weekly videos. Nowadays we have so many tools at our disposal to make comics. There's all kinds of materials and programs and apps and all the things. And it's easy to get overwhelmed by all the choices that we need to make when we start out. How do we know which materials to use, and how do we know that we're making the right decisions? I just want to start by saying that there's no right and wrong answers. You can make comics in every single way. I 100% believe that. You can make them 100% traditionally, 100% digitally, and everything in between. You can make comics on post-it notes, or you can make them in any program. What's best for you is a very personal choice, and it depends on a few things. And in this video, I'm going to dive into the pros and cons of both traditional and digital comic making, and I will pose a few questions that can help you decide on your comic making media. So I'll dive into traditional first. And first we're going to talk about the pros of working on your comic traditionally with traditional materials. And first and foremost is accessibility. It's super easy to get started making comics just on paper. You don't need any expensive equipment like iPads and computers and programs and Photoshop and all the things. You can just start by having paper and pencil. That's it. Or just pen and a post-it note. You can just make a simple comic in pencil. Everybody can make comics, and this is one of the very big reasons why. Another pro is that once you've chosen your materials and you have all of that figured out, you have a very clear idea how your comic is going to look. And oftentimes that material is final. So you need to be careful. For example, if you work in paint, you need to be careful not to ruin your artwork. So you need to plan every single step carefully. And I actually see that as a pro because you're less prone to noodling and over rendering and all of that stuff. You become a little bit more deliberate. And sometimes I feel like, at least for me, when I work digitally, you have a tendency to just zoom in and go in on all the details and stuff that you might not even see when the page is published on the web. So for me, that's actually a big pro. And obviously the last pro is that you will have original artwork to sell. And you can imagine that if you sell an original page of your comic, you can ask a pretty good price for that, and you can bring them to cons, and just people really like having something tactile and saying like, this is the actual comic. So that's a very big pro as well, especially if you're not too attached to those pages yourself, and maybe you wanna auction them off or whatever. You can do that. And of course, there's a few cons to working purely traditional as well. And one of the biggest ones is if you're doing a webcomic, you have to digitize the end result of your traditional comic. So that means scanning it in or taking very, very good photos and stuff. And that can be a little tedious. You might actually need to do some cleanup. You might have to touch up the colors a bit or erase some grain. That's a tedious piece of work that you need to be doing if you want to digitize it for the web. Obviously, a big con to working fully traditionally is, of course, not being able to erase your mistakes. If you work in very final stuff, you might still be able to do something, especially if you're going to digitize it later, cover up some mistakes with white gouache or something like that. But, mistakes are there. And some actually like that. They think it's charming that some art is not perfect. That's totally fine, but it's harder to undo some mistakes and mess ups, especially like if you spill something on a page or whatever. That just is not fun. So that's a con, I would say, to working traditionally. And then the last con, I would say, for traditional art is that you can make less use of certain shortcuts and ways in digital programs that you can speed up the comic process. So some things might actually go slower. For example, if you hand letter your comic, that will obviously be slower than just copy pasting your script on a page, making it pretty, and then putting a balloon around it in a digital way. But as with everything has pros and cons, and that goes for digital comics as well, like fully digitally made comics. But first I will dive into the pros of working digitally. And obviously one very big pro of working digitally is making use of all the shortcuts. I made a video last week that is about flatting your comics digitally for use of color. And you know, those kinds of things, you can make use of smart ways to flat, for example, that really speed up the coloring process of your comic page, for example. Another thing obviously is things like lettering usually goes faster. Making the balloons, making layouts goes a lot faster. And you can make use of all the tools that are available to you in digital programs that help you, you know, draw, using mask, using adjustment layers on your colors, and all of that stuff is just handy. Another big pro is that oftentimes it is a one-time investment that you need to make, or at least for a very long time. You know, a computer, a tablet, most software, it's becoming less and less. Like a lot of software nowadays is becoming subscription based, in which case this pro is actually not applicable. But at least you know, buying an iPad with Procreate, for example, and I don't make comics in Procreate, it's not really made for it, but you can technically do it. You know, that's a one-time investment, and then you can just go. And that is different than, for example, if you use markers or you use paint. And then the third pro is that especially if you make comics on an iPad with an Apple Pencil and then something like Clip Studio Paint, which has a mobile app, portability is a very, very big pro. You can technically make comics everywhere, and that frees up some time for you to be able to work on it more regularly. Then the cons, and one I already kind of mentioned when I was talking about traditional artwork, and that is the tendency to noodle, over-render, zoom in too much, and go into detail a lot. I hear from a lot of artists that when they work digitally, they have a tendency to be more perfectionistic about stuff, because eventually if you do too much to a traditional piece, you will mess it up. But in digital, you can undo and redo and all the things, so you can just keep noodling forever. And that can be a big con, actually. Second con, you need to be careful about backups. I've heard more than once that people had a computer crash, or you know, they were working on something and their app crashed, or Photoshop crashed. Lately there has been a Procreate update and some people updated and lost all of their work, which is a nightmare. You need to make sure to back up. And even for traditional, like some form of backup in the form of photos or whatever is helpful. I had my bag stolen once, and there were so many thumbnails in that bag. It was one of the worst things in that bag that got stolen. Like, I had a lot of stuff in that bag, but that was one of the worst things. But when you work digitally, especially, take your precautions. And then the last con that I want to mention is related to what I mentioned earlier, and that is you don't have original art to sell. Some artists work around that by having, for example, prints, and then having limited prints and stuff like that. You can absolutely do that, but the traditional piece of artwork in general, you know, can be worth a lot more and can be more special and more in demand than digital artwork. So one way to circumvent all of these cons for both is obviously working in some form of hybrid. It's actually what I do as well. Part of my process is traditional and part of my process is digital. I really like to do thumbnails, especially, and you know, coming up with the first ideas for layout and stuff on paper. I just need the freedom and the tactile feel of paper. I need to work in a final medium, so I use ink pens and markers for my thumbnails. Sometimes I do sketches on paper. So I really, for some reason, I cannot really do it digitally. I start noodling, and my thumbnails just don't come out right for some reason. I might actually do some cleanup on my thumbnails digitally, but I really like to thumbnail traditionally. And then for my pencils, it doesn't really matter to me. I really like sketching on paper. I really like penciling on paper as well. But I've done both, and they're both fine to me, like drawing digitally, drawing on paper. As long as it's not the final product, it doesn't matter, because I have drawn, you know, printed out some of my pages, like the page layout in blue lines, and then I sketched on them with pencil, and then just taking a photo of it. You just have to be careful that you're not skewing your camera, so it actually comes out the way it is on a paper, and then I ink over it. And the sketches actually, they don't need to be neat or anything as long as I know where to put my ink lines. So I've done that as well. But for the final end product, everything that is end product, which is basically starting from the ink stage, to me, I want to do digital because I don't want to be dealing with anything like scanning and touching everything up. So I do the final thing, like the inks and the color, I do that digitally. I really like having adjustment layers and being able to manipulate my colors very easily. So that's the reason I do that. I actually know that some people, like, for example, Jason Brubaker did that for his comic Sithra. He would do, I think he would do the thumbnailing and the sketching and everything. He would do that digitally and then print it in light blue and ink traditionally on top of it. So if you really like inking with actual ink, then sure, you can do that. And some people do everything, do everything traditionally and then do only the color like last. I had a comic project where I did that, scanning in the ink lines and then coloring digitally on top of it. For you, it might be different. And that's why I am going to ask you some questions, because what works for me might not work for you. So here are 3 questions you can ask yourself to figure out what kind of materials you want to use. Question number 1. What media am I already familiar with? Especially for newer comic artists, I always suggest that you start with the materials you already know, because if you have to figure out how to make comics and figure out a new medium, like you can maybe do that for a 2-page comic or whatever, but for anything really long, like don't bite off too much, like more than you can chew, and just start with something that you know. Start with something that's simple for you, comes easy to you. That's my biggest tip there when you're starting out. There's an exception, and that's when your comic has a goal that sounds like this. I want to teach myself a certain technique, a certain medium, or a program. Again, when you're a new comic artist, I want to ask you to think twice about this, because you really want to figure out the comic process first and keep it really simple for yourself at first. And when you're familiar with the process, go all out with all the new stuff. Like my first comics were all just pencil. They were pencil, and then later some ink and some color pencil. I didn't use all the fancy stuff. It was what I know, and I was like, I know how to draw, I have pencils, I want to make a comic, let's do this. And then I taught myself to do art digitally, and then I got into, but how do I actually make layouts and balloons, and how does lettering work digitally and all of that stuff. So I took it in small steps. It's something I recommend you do as well. Like, there's so much to learn at the beginning. If you have a tendency to get overwhelmed with all this new stuff, then just go the easy way. But if you really want to challenge yourself with a certain kind of, like I said, technique, maybe you really want to make a watercolor comic, I don't know, just saying something, or you want to teach yourself Clip Studio Paint, what best way to do that than to make a comic. So if you want to challenge yourself in any way, then that obviously informs your comic making as well. And lastly, do you want your comic to have a certain kind of look? A lot of people will really like that their comic will still have some traditional kind of like feel, and that's, for example, like I mentioned Jason Brubaker before, and he does that as well. Like, he makes a lot of textures. I think he does that with acrylics, or maybe he uses watercolor as well, and he will use all of those textures because he doesn't like it looking too digital. Other people love things looking digital. They will go all out with gradients and stuff. That's totally fine. Of course, you can make your comic the way you want it to look. Like, how do you want your inks to look? Do you want to hand letter your balloons because you think it fits your comic the best? Be careful though. Like, there are those super, super rendered painted comics, but those are usually made by people who have a lot of experience and can crank out that stuff pretty fast. So time is of the essence as well. At first you might want to look at what can I crank out the fastest that will still look good. But then the more experience you get and the faster you become, then obviously you can go for more complicated looks, or have a certain aesthetic to your comics. But that is a factor as well that you need to take into account when you start a new comic project. So as you can see, there's no right or wrong way to make your comic, no right or wrong media to choose. Like I said, you can take a ballpoint pen and a stack of post-it notes and you can make a comic like that. You can make something super cute out of that, or something with a lot of heavy hatching. It's all possible. It all depends on your experience with certain kind of media, what kind of materials and tools you already have in your home, the look you want to give your comic, and the amount of time that you want to spend on your comic, and then how much you want to challenge yourself. And all of this stuff is actually one of the first steps when you start your comic and when you are figuring out how you want your comic to look. And if you want to know more about how to start your comic, and if you want to know more about these kinds of decisions that you need to be making at the beginning, and keep an eye out for my upcoming course, How to Start a Comic. I will launch that this fall on Kickstarter. And if you go to the description, you can sign up for my notification list so I can send you an email the moment my course goes live on Kickstarter. That was it for this week. I want to thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, please leave it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and for now, go out and make some comics.